But in order to really understand academic success and difficulties, and in order to understand life success and difficulties, we need to measure more than just this concept of general ability.
Equitable assessment in education is more than just a goal. It's a necessity. But how can we ensure that our methods are truly inclusive, especially for students from diverse backgrounds? What role does the Naglieri Nonverbal Ability Test play in this mission? We're diving deep into these questions and more with Jack Naglieri, emeritus professor at George Mason University, senior research scientist at the Devereux Center for Resilient Children, and creator of the NNAT, among other tests, for this special two-part series. The first is straight ahead on episode 229. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris, and this is the Neurodiversity Podcast.
What is neurodiversity? You see the world differently.
Autism spectrum.
Gifted.
Complexities that are inherently inside.
ADHD.
Dysgraphia.
Tourette's.
All brains are different.
You are exactly what this world needs.
This is the
Neurodiversity
Podcast.
I've just survived a whirlwind of 3 weeks working with teachers in 4 different states as schools have been completing their end-of-year professional development on supporting neurodivergent or twice exceptional learners. Working with educators and speaking to parents who are passionate about supporting neurodivergent kids is one of the greatest privileges I have in my work. I know there are a lot of you out there, though, who may not have the chance to attend in-person trainings like these, but you'd still love to learn more about how to use a neurodiversity-affirming framework with your students. So, I want to remind you that you can access a lot of my pre-recorded courses on the Neurodiversity University online learning platform. And we have a summer special of 50% off all of our self-study courses that you can access right now by using the code SUMMER24. That's SUMMER24. So feel free to check out all the modules about executive functioning, 2E learners, dyslexia, and more. Just head on over to neurodiversity.university or click the link in the show notes. Okay, part 1 of Measuring Thinking Rather Than Knowledge with Dr. Jack Naglieri is up next.
previously on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
With kids, particularly where behavior is, bumpy, we'll call it that. Mm-hmm. I think there's so much parental energy and how do we control a kid's behavior when, of course, our goal is really how do we help them develop self-control. The challenge, of course, is it tends to be messy before it's less messy. What's interesting for me is the rage quitting or the anxious avoidance. I mean, all of these things are stress systems that are overwhelmed. And when I, as a parent, as a teacher, or administrator, whatever, go in and try to start controlling kids, by definition, I'm increasing their stress because I'm decreasing their healthy sense of control.
That's episode 206. Find it wherever you get your podcasts.
Today, I'm welcoming Dr. Jack Naglieri to the podcast. Jack is an emeritus professor at George Mason University and senior research scientist at the Devereux Center for Resilient Children. He is also one of the creators and authors of the Naglieri Nonverbal Ability Test, which I'm sure many of our listeners have heard of in one way or another. So, Jack, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
It's a real pleasure. I look forward to our conversation.
So I was presenting at a conference up in Virginia about a month or so ago. We had a great conversation about some of the misconceptions and ways that we understand intelligence. And as somebody who is always trying to learn more and challenge commonly held beliefs, I felt like this was a great conversation for us to bring to our audience. So I guess maybe where I want to start with this conversation perhaps is just for you to share a little bit about some of the history about intelligence testing, some of the myths or misunderstandings that have really brought us from where we used to be to where we are now, hopefully moving forward.
Well, that's really a great question and a great way to contextualize this concept of neurodiversity, actually. So I started working as a school psychologist in 1975, a couple of years ago.
Just a few.
Just a few. And I noticed something as a 25-year-old, something that was actually going to become a theme of mine over the decades and really over just about my entire career. And that was that the intelligence test that we used and still use required that the student be able to answer questions. And the questions are the kinds of things that they learn in school, like vocabulary, arithmetic word problems, and things like that. And it bothered me because I saw the same kind of questions in the achievement tests that I was giving. And I was like, wait a second, how can what we measure when we're trying to measure intelligence, how can we have the same kind of questions there as when we try to measure achievement? And it bothered me. But I was a 25-year-old, and what do I know? So when I went off for my PhD at the University of Georgia and actually worked on the original version of the KABC, there was a lot of discussion of, was the verbal part of the WISC, for example, really achievement or not? And I was convinced that it was. But I really got convinced when I started teaching in Northern Arizona University, and we did some work in the Havasupai tribe. We actually went in to the Grand Canyon, to this tribe that is literally in the Grand Canyon. And I remember testing a young lady, this is in 1981, and she got a very low score on the verbal side and a kind of an average score on what we would call a nonverbal side. And it occurred to me that that score could not be used as a way of measuring intelligence. Now, I had a lot of trouble with my colleagues at the university who said, no, Jack, you don't understand. Native Americans live on the desert. They need to have good spatial skills, so the right brains are better than the left brains. And I remember thinking, that's really silly. They just don't speak English, and we're penalizing for it.
Mm-hmm.
That's not right. So that's how I started with nonverbal assessment. And my Naglieri Nonverbal Ability Test was really created initially in 1985 under a different name called matrix analogies. But in any case, I did find out that a more equitable way to measure intelligence was to measure what we would call nonverbal, and you get equity that way, which is critically important. But then I kept wondering, why do we have this verbal stuff on all these achievement tests and on the intelligence tests? And the more I read and the more old books I accumulated, it became clearer and clearer. The reason tests like the WISC, like the Stanford-Binet, like the Woodcock-Johnson, the differential ability scales, the reason that they have verbal tests was because of Lewis Terman, who created the Stanford-Binet. But really interestingly, Alfred Binet excluded tests that demanded knowledge in his 1911 final version that he created before he died a year or so later. So Binet, I would argue, was right. Terman, I would argue, is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's kind of the nuts and bolts of the thing. But there's something also missing that's critically important. That's called a theory. Where did these people get these ideas? Why did Terman put verbal stuff into Binet's work? Because Terman said he thought that was the highest form of mental activity. In other words, there's no theory.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, here's what we did. And that's where we are today. The WISC hasn't changed since 1939 when Wexler first published it. You're going to get a new WISC 6 and a new Stanford-Binet and all that kind of stuff, but it's the same old stuff. And does it really help us? It only helps us in the general sense. It doesn't help us in a specific sense. And we need to be able to look at specific abilities in order to understand why one student can't do reading decoding, why another student can't understand what they're reading, why another student can't control him or herself in a complex environment, and on and on.
It's important to contextualize this because that does really influence how we see things and how we move forward. During our conversation that we had up in Virginia, one of the things that you mentioned specifically was that you do not like the name of the Naglieri Nonverbal Ability Test. Tell me a little bit about that.
Okay. So the Naglieri Nonverbal Ability Test, the third most widely used test for identification of gifted children, was really my first tool that I created in 1985, as I said. It was reasonable to call it nonverbal ability test because that's something that people understand, but they don't really understand it at the level that I'll describe in a minute. Mainly the idea is that you're going to measure a student's intelligence in a way that's not confounded by knowledge. Measure thinking rather than knowing. And it's very helpful for large-scale assessment, large-scale screening to try to find who's smart and should be gifted. And that, as it was called, and up to the third edition, has been very successful in that. And I've published paper after paper after paper illustrating just how powerful it is. But I never liked the name. And I became more and more displeased with the name because people would say to me, well, that means you're measuring nonverbal intelligence. And I would say, no, that's not what I'm measuring. What I'm measuring is general ability with test questions that don't include verbal content. Now, I had the great opportunity about 8 years ago to go to the next level with my nonverbal test, which is what I did with two wonderful colleagues. And we created like a next edition of that and an expansion at the same time. And I changed the name. Instead of Naglieri Nonverbal Ability Test, we call it Naglieri General Ability Tests, verbal, nonverbal, and quantitative. And these tests are so much more powerful than what the NNAT was, and they're so much more effective for identifying gifted children. But again, it's this concept of general ability has utility, but it's not going to tell us about neurodiversity. Mm-hmm. It's not their goal, and they're not created in such a way that that would be possible. They're created for, got to test 2,000 kids in the next 2 weeks? No problem.
Yeah. One of the things that you were pushing back on a little bit that I had talked about in my presentation, I think is something that's pretty common knowledge. And that is kind of this understanding that there are these different types of skills. So like you can have verbal ability and visual spatial ability, and like that these are somehow kind of separate. But in the way that you conceptualize intelligence, you look at it much differently as far as the processes go. Tell me a little bit about what we're getting wrong there and how you conceptualize the cognitive processes that lead to variation and, differences in ability.
Okay, that's a really great question, a really important question. With my work in the gifted field, I continually tell people that meets a certain need. But in order to really understand academic success and difficulties, and in order to understand life success and difficulties, we need to measure more than just this concept of general ability. So, how would we go about doing that? Well, I criticized Terman because he put into the Stanford Binet what he thought was important. In 1984, a colleague and friend of mine, J.P. Das, a cognitive psychologist, actually from Canada up in Alberta. He and I met and we decided that we wanted to build from the ground up an intelligence test based on a theory of intelligence. Not one that we created, but rather a theory of intelligence that's based on brain function. And JP and I both had a lot of knowledge about neuropsychology and especially about the work of Soviet neuropsychologist A.R. Luria. It was in 1972 when Luria first published a paper in Scientific American, which I read and was thrilled about, because to me, what Luria did was lay out the groundwork, a formula, a map of intelligence. For us, that was the map that we followed when we created the cognitive assessment system, which is designed to measure 4 basic psychological processes so that we can differentiate all these different people, because people are different in a lot of ways and certainly different in their cognitive processes. So what did we do? We wanted to measure 4 basic psychological processes described by Luria. And I think the beauty of these processes is that they're easy to explain.
Mm-hmm.
So we call this PASS theory, PASS. So the PASS theory of intelligence is so actually simple and complex at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
P stands for planning. What we mean by that is frontal lobe functioning, also described as executive function or metacognition and those kinds of things. But I like to describe planning as the thinking a person uses when they have to figure out how to do something. Attention is the thinking that a person uses when they have to focus and resist distractions. Simultaneous processing is the kind of thinking that we use when we have to pull things together, whether they're physical things or ideas. You could call it spatial. You could even call it visual spatial, but it's not necessarily visual. But it's all about how things go together. Gestalt psychology is really all about simultaneous processing. And then successive processing, the last. Successive processing is the thinking that you use whenever sequencing is involved. So when you're trying to do reading decoding, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So planning is the part that's problematic for people who have ADHD, the hyperactive impulsive kind of a person. The attention part we see with people who have autism. It's not that they can't attend, it's that they can't shift.
Mm-hmm.
Simultaneous processing is that we'll see people who have trouble with reading comprehension, like, how do I get all these ideas together? Those are oftentimes the people who don't get the joke or the nuance or aspect. And successive processing is key indicator of dyslexia, failure to work with information in order. Now, I'm just calling out these specifics, but of course it's more complicated than that. But basically, that's what our theory of intelligence is all about. It's about our brains. And shouldn't that be what an intelligence test measures?
Right. It's fascinating to think about. And so each of these cognitive processes, is it fair to call them cognitive process, planning?
Yes, but I wouldn't call them skills.
Okay.
It's very common to people talk about executive function skills. So let me explain what a skill is. A skill is something that you can do fluently. Fluently means without really trying, or another way to say it, without really thinking about what you're doing. So when people say, oh, we want this person to increase their executive function skills, I say no, because executive function is thinking about what you're doing. Because it's thinking, it can't be a skill.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very important distinction. When we are acquiring skills, we use PASS. That's the foundation of learning. But skills are things we do without thinking. We drive a car and we're talking on the phone, listen to the radio or whatever. We don't really think so much about it, except if we go to a country we have to drive on the other side of the road. Then you're really thinking about it.
Yes.
Right? So you've really lost that skill to do it. So PASS are not skills. These are basic psychological processes related to different parts of the brain. As I said, planning, the front part of the brain, attention, the base of the brain, simultaneous occipital parietal, successive temporal.
Mm-hmm.
So we didn't make this up, but we devised tests to measure those 4 dimensions. And we spent almost 12 years developing them.
Mm-hmm.
So we developed tests, then we tested the test. Then we did that again. We did many iterations to get tests that measure these processes and have enough power to actually tell us about people.
And so you're talking about the cognitive assessment system, or CAS, correct?
That's correct.
So this is something that really looks at these functions, these skills, processes.
Good. I didn't want to correct you.
I would love for you to correct me because I want to, it's important, I think, to kind of reconceptualize some of these things. But then it really does give us a learning profile of students, if we're using it with students, to really see where their strengths are, where their struggles are, and how that's going to impact them academically.
That's exactly right. And it's that profile that we want to look for. And that profile, that PASS profile, will help us understand why some students struggle and why some students succeed. I'll give you an example. Last week I was speaking in New Jersey, and there was a man there with a academic instructional methodology for teaching chemistry. And what it was all these little pieces that you would put together to build the chemical, instead of the way I didn't really learn very well chemistry, of memorizing all the valences and that this plus that equals the other thing, and that's why they go together. But this man had the actual way of building them. And I had a great conversation with him saying, you know what, if I was taught chemistry that way, I might have gone into that as my profession because I love that. But I wasn't. And it's okay because I like psychology anyway. But really, the instructional methodology has a PASS profile.
Mm.
When you teach a student to read using phonics, that's highly dependent upon successive processing. When you teach a student to learn words by looking at the whole word, that's a simultaneous processing approach to teaching. When you teach a student to stop and think about several ways you could do this math problem, that's an instruction that demands planning. And when you remind a student when they're doing a multiple choice test to be thoughtful about looking very precisely at the options, because oftentimes they're only slightly different, that's an environment that demands lots of attention. So we have the people who have these variabilities, and then we have the instruction that has variabilities. That's what makes it really fun.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. So what people are most used to is the WISC. That's like what everybody knows when they're talking about intelligence testing. This is a much different way of looking at intelligence, although it seems like it's a much more equitable and informative piece of information that you're gathering. Where are the areas of overlap there? And then what are the things that really set this apart? I mean, I know you've given us a lot of information about these past processes, but also just to be really explicit about it for everybody to kind of get a grip on the differences there.
The first difference is that the cognitive assessment system was explicitly built on a theory, whereas those tests were not. Now, what implications does that have? Well, that means what's measured by the cognitive assessment system is not constrained by what was measured by the WISC. And when we developed the CAS, we were very cognizant of the fact that we were going to measure things that were not measured on the WISC, especially planning and attention. Simultaneous processing and successive processing, they have some relationship to some parts of the WISC and other tests. Successive processing with any kind of digit span forward, not digit span backwards, however, because that's a combination of successive and planning, as was shown in a very good research paper some years ago. And simultaneous processing is similar to like block design or object assembly. So you could think of it as CAS is bringing another 50% more into the discussion of how can we measure intelligence in as inclusive a way in terms of conceptually inclusive.
Part 2 of Measuring Thinking Rather Than Knowledge with Dr. Jack Naglieri will be on our next episode.
Everybody thinks the Wechsler is an intelligence test and it's some kind of gold standard. And same thing true for the Binet and the other tests that have been so widely used. Everybody knows it. Well, they think they know it. There's a lot of research that's come out in the last 15 years by people who I respect tremendously, who are saying that the way that these tests are being interpreted is not supported by the science.
If you want to learn more, you can check out Dr. Naglieri's mini-book, Pass Theory of Intelligence and the CAS 2, which is free and available for download. You can find the link in the show notes. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. I'll see you next time on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Part 2 of the conversation with Dr. Jack Naglieri will be available tomorrow, June 20th, if you're listening on release day. And if not, it's available now on episode 230. Thanks to Jack for joining us. Check the show notes for links and to check out his free mini-book. Our host is Emily Kircher-Morris. Our office manager and social media director is Krista Brown. I'm the executive producer, Dave Morris. For all of us, thank you for listening, and we will see you next time. This is a service of the Neurodiversity Alliance.